A great pleasure to be here with you all. The most powerful experience of the Catholic worker I ever had was at St. Joseph's House on First and First in New York City. Through some friends there, I was invited to celebrate Dorothy Day's 100th birthday there at the worker, which was spectacular, but in fact that was actually the second best experience, because just after that, I celebrated the Easter Vigil Mass there. And as many of you will know, like at many workers, right? There on the steel cutting board table where we chop up the vegetables and make the meals for these people, I celebrated Mass. And to have the bread that became the body of Christ confected at the same place that the soup that's made to feed the body of Christ there in the city felt to me the perfect image, not just image, the realization of the kind of mission that the Catholic worker has carried out, seeks to carry out, that God wants to carry out through the worker. So I'm very honored to be here and to say a few words about this, and then to introduce our speaker, Jon. When I was a young man, I think Catholicism seduced me through ideas. And I remember walking out of my first philosophy class and leaving and going, looking at the sky, not really sure anything what I believed, and kind of yelling inside my head, how come no one ever taught me this before? And those ideas captivated me, and what the worker did, what Peter and Dorothy and many living human beings did, was say, these are not just ideas, these are human beings that you have to encounter and that you may encounter. And that transformation has led through many twists and turns to this kind of experience. In fact, those transformations, those encounters, that practicality, the persons that are there in the worker, are in fact, I think, at the heart of the kind of work that Jon's going to introduce us to, Dr. Sozek is going to introduce us to this evening. So we were having a little meal over here earlier, and he told, I think, a really nice anecdote that summarizes the dilemmas that our beloved Roman Catholic Church faces in our secular age today. He said, more or less, the Church agrees that we have to make a transformation of our tradition into personalism. We have to focus on persons who are right before us. And he's written in his dissertation that there are different ways of focusing on this kind of personalism. One kind of personalism that really exemplified by persons like our beloved, St. Pope John Paul II, or Pope St. John Paul II, and also Pope Benedict XVI, focuses on personalism of the objective, right? What is the universal thing that is shared by all human beings? What is this personhood that we can all look at and say, there it is, right? That. And then there's this other less controllable, more unruly strand of personalism that is birthed in different ways, from Mounier and through Peter Maurin, and then, according to Dr. Sozek, into Pope Francis himself today, that focuses less on the objective and more on the unruly lightning bolt, he said, of the subjective aspect of the human person who is right here in front of us. And the capacity to pay loving attention, the way that Jesus did, to those kinds of persons, is one of the institutionalized skills that the worker has attempted to preserve over many years. And so if it's true that we have in our church these two strands of personalism, the only other strand we have are those who are kind of resisting the turn to personalism today in our church. So that means if we're sitting around at a table, we've mostly got Pope Francis sitting here on one, or Peter Maurin sitting on one side, the lightning bolt of the human person in its subjective reality. And then we have these others, brilliant and loving also, who are emphasizing, no, this is the universal objective of what it means to be a human person. John Paul II or Pope Benedict sitting there, emphasizing the universal. And then we have Mel Gibson over here. So given our beloved brothers and sisters who may be on this side, we're going to focus on our collective dilemmas that we face and the objective and subjective dilemmas of personhood. And we're going to be able to do this through the words of Dr. Jon Sozek this evening. As many of you know, Jon teaches philosophy and religion at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven. He also creates videos that he's recorded from the many classes he's taught there. His YouTube channel is called Labyrinth, a really beautiful title. So you can listen to the lectures that his students may get to enjoy if you would like to. His academic research focuses on the philosophy of personalism, a good thing for us this evening, and understandings of personal identity. And he also does work on phenomenology, existentialism, theories of religion and modernity, secularism. He, like me, is a great-great-grandchild of the modern father of the church, Charles Taylor, so I'm happy to say we are in good hands this evening. His talk, his keynote lecture this evening is going to be, as you can see behind me, entitled Personalism on the Streets, Peter Maurin and Emmanuel Mounier. In this lecture, Jon will examine the influence on Peter Maurin of the work done by Mounier, who's the founder and a lifelong advocate of the personalist movement in France. Considered specifically this evening, we can pay special attention to two particular easy essays in which Maurin refers directly to Mounier's work and the content of Mounier's own landmark, Personalist Manifesto, which Maurin himself, I did not know this in fact, Peter Maurin arranged to be translated into English from the French by the monks of St. John's Abbey. Peter Maurin's then reception of Mounier, as one author has said, enabled personalism to, quote, flourish on the streets in a form of Catholic activism. And in his keynote, Jon will sketch out the implications of a personalism like this, like a lightning bolt from the sky for our own times. We welcome you, Jon.
All right, I'm going to readjust this microphone a little bit. Good evening, friends, Patty and James. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you. Indeed, I've taught at a number of Catholic institutions, and one thing that's always struck me is the universality of a focus on the whole human person, right? In all of its glossy literature, every Catholic institution of higher learning will emphasize that it will teach the whole human person, right? And so I got to thinking, well, where did that come from, and why is it that people think in such very different ways about the whole human person? If you look back across the history of Catholic thought, the Catholic intellectual tradition, I mean, you can look at Augustine, you can kind of look at Aquinas or Pascal. There are plenty of figures who have focused on what we today could call the whole human person. But the centrality of that figure is pretty new, right? So I became interested in the intellectual history of this idea of the whole human person in Catholic circles, and in my dissertation engaged in a kind of cartography of personalism. Personalism, is it a movement? Is it a philosophy? My advisors wanted to know, and I was never entirely sure how to classify it. We know that Martin Luther King Jr. was educated at Boston University with the Boston personalists, and throughout his life identified as a personalist philosopher. We know, of course, that John Paul II, his dissertation on Max Scheler and later on John of the Cross, emphasized personalism across his career. We know that Peter and Dorothy, of course, took on board what we're going to talk about tonight, the personalism of Emmanuel Mounier and Jacques Maritain, both of whom were very important for the movement. And also, I learned throughout my studies of the question that Charles Taylor and Paul Ricoeur especially were very much connected with this movement. In fact, Paul Ricoeur was a close personal friend of Mounier and wrote a beautiful kind of celebration of Mounier's life upon his very early death in 1950. He died about the age of 45. So today we're looking at a slice of that kind of cartographical work, specifically at how Peter Maurin both received and I think developed in a really instructive and important way the work of Emmanuel Mounier, including the Personalist Manifesto, but some of his other works as well. I'm just going to lower the screen here. And everybody can see me and hear things, yes? Excellent, okay. In Europe, Francis Sisius writes in 1982, personalism has become an abstraction relegated to philosophical journals and conferences. In America, it flourishes on the streets in the form of Catholic activism. My research yields the result that this is correct. Yes, I mean, in Europe, personalism is a discussion topic in the seminar room very often, right? We're talking about the subjective or the objective nature of the human person. We're talking about abstract questions. In the life of Dorothy and Peter, however, and of all of those engaged in the work of the Catholic worker movement, it takes on a much more concrete purpose. In my remarks, I'd like to kind of emphasize that difference, both to trace some lines of connection. That'll be our agenda item number 1 here. I'd like to say a bit about Mounier, his journal, Esprit, and how Maurin received that work. But then in sections 2 and 3, how Mounier kind of went in one direction, and Peter and Dorothy went in a different direction. Not incompatible, but different in their emphases, yielding, I think, that quote from Francis Sisius. And then at the end, there will be some time, God willing, for questions and conversation. Here we have some images of the cover of the journal Esprit, founded in 1933 by Emmanuel Mounier. He's depicted here probably in the 1940s, when the journal was well established. He was born in Grenoble in France. Kind of a middle-class, philosophically inclined student. He went to the Sorbonne. He graduated near the top of his class. He could have pursued a career teaching in philosophy. He didn't. He decided to start this journal in large part because of his connection with this gentleman here, Jacques Maritain. So Mounier, impressionable undergraduate, goes to the salon held regularly at the Maritain household, Raissa and Jacques welcoming all the intellectual luminaries of the moment and curious students to discuss matters of the day. Among them was Gabriel Marcel, who will not be depicted on the slide, but especially and significantly Nicholas Berdyaev. Tomorrow, I understand, we will be having a roundtable on the work of Berdyaev very significantly, very important for the movement and for personalism. In fact, just as a sidebar, I think the Eastern Orthodox influence on the development of personalism, largely through the influence of Berdyaev, is really important. Like Sobornost, community, right? Everybody coming together. I don't think that the Catholic tradition probably could entirely on its own have produced what we call here personalism without the influence of Orthodox ideas. There's Emmanuel Mounier at the salons. He's 26, 27. He's got big ideas. And he wants Jacques Maritain to use his influence to help Mounier and his little group get things going. And Maritain is happy to do it, but personalism at this time, in ways I will have occasion to mention later, is a term that's kind of in the air. Mounier is not the only personalist in Paris in the early 1930s. Raymond de Becker, Belgian figure, is the founder of a group called L'Ordre Nouveau, influential youth movement in Paris at the time. And there are other groups of people using this focus on the human person as a radical political tool. Maritain is a little worried because he doesn't want Mounier to kind of swing off onto the deep end here, right? So he says, okay, I will bankroll and print the first copy of your journal if you have Berdyaev consult at every step and publish a major piece in the first issue. He says, okay, good. So he did. And the journal was born. In that first issue, Mounier sets forth his program. We must create, he says in the text here, remaking the Renaissance. To remake the Renaissance, we must create a new habit of the person, a habit of seeing all human problems from the point of view of the good of the human community and not from that of the caprices of the individual. Mounier understood himself to be opposed to individualism. The community is not all, but a human person who is isolated is nothing. Communism, the other thing to be avoided, is a philosophy of the third person, the impersonal. But there are two philosophies of the first person, two ways to think and pronounce the first person. We are opposed to the philosophy of me, individualism associated with the United States, and for the philosophy of we. This became his personalism. Now, we note a couple of things from this passage, I think, or we can note a couple of things. Number one, Mounier was very interested in kind of locating personalism in relation to other isms of the time, right? Personalism was not individualism. It was not communism. What is it? Well, he tried several times to answer that question, but often he did define his position against others. Also, we see this tension between the two philosophies of the first person, he calls them, basically individualism and personalism. That's going to be a constant challenge. And is personalism focused mainly on the individual and her subjective life, or is it focused on the community? Mounier insisted on referring to this movement as personalist communitarianism, but thought, and I guess we can agree, that's kind of a mouthful, so it was shortened to just personalism. Mounier formed around him a group of like-minded individuals, among them, for various periods of time, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Simone Weil, Jacques Ellul. They were all members of the study circles across France that formed around this new journal, Esprit. Somehow they got up enough money in a few years to buy a home formerly owned by the author Chateaubriand, the author of The Genius of Catholicism from the early 19th century. And this they dubbed it Les Murs Blancs, the white walls. And this is, to this day, the headquarters of the L'Association des Amis d'Emmanuel Mounier, the Friends of Emmanuel Mounier. And there's actually, a few years ago, been a big publishing push. The house Parole et Silence in Paris has been republishing all of Mounier's books. There's a lot of interest in it. You can get the 4-volume work of his complete works in French. So, in France, and Esprit, by the way, the journal that we're talking about, it's still published in France. If you walk into a bookstore in Paris, you will see Esprit right there. And it still says on the cover, founded by Emmanuel Mounier. So this is a very real existing thing that we're talking about, not simply a matter of intellectual history. Here's our first easy essay. Patty mentioned that I'd be talking about 2. Well, Lincoln's book was so useful, I'm going to be talking about 5. But I'll try to make them brief. Esprit, published in April 1935. I believe this is the first direct mention of Emmanuel Mounier by Peter Maurin. The French magazine Esprit carried on a campaign for communitarianism. In the January issue, Emmanuel Mounier has a 32-page article on the communitarian revolution. He's also quite smitten with its international character. Other articles are entitled Russian Communitarian Tradition, German Communitarian Tradition, French. The last article is entitled Christian Communities. Importantly, the magazine Esprit is not a Catholic magazine. It is a magazine where Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and humanists are trying to promote a kind of society where man will be human to man, where it's easier to be good, I think he says, at other times. That same year, in December, he returns to Mounier, a new movement. This was published twice. I see I've only noted one of the dates. The Nazis, the fascists, and the Bolshevists are totalitarians. The Catholic worker is communitarian. The principles of communitarianism are expounded every month in the French magazine Esprit, meaning the spirit, also meaning mind, by the way, interestingly. Emmanuel Mounier, editor of the magazine, has a book entitled La Révolution Personaliste et Communautaire. Raymond de Becker is the leader in Belgium of the communitarian movement, to whom we will return presently. The premier of Belgium, Van Zeeland, is a communitarian. This book is significant. This was published in 1935, and it was one of, count them, 4 efforts by Mounier to lay out in a systematic way what the heck he means by personalism. So this was the first one, Révolution Personaliste et Communautaire, followed by the book that will occupy our attention more robustly here, A Personalist Manifesto. This is like take 2. It's the one that worked, right? Then in 1949, he writes this in the Que sais-je series, What Do You Think? The Personalisme. And for a while, I thought this was the same as the one you've probably heard of by Mounier, the 1950 volume Personalism. Those are different books, fun fact, right? So he published one in 1949 called Personalism, and a second one in 1950 called Personalism. The Que sais-je series is a kind of memoir. It starts by talking about the 1929 stock market crash and how these young people were just dreaming about the future. The Personalism book is a much more systematic, kind of mature statement of his complete view on the subject. But these are 4 book-length efforts by Mounier and company, I would hazard to propose, to articulate what they mean by personalism. And this alone shows you just how kind of heady this movement was, right? They were trying to get the formulation right. They wanted to get the manifesto clearly stated. Maurin was interested. Here we have If You Want to Know, published one time in October of 1938. So this is just after the English translation of the Personalist Manifesto has been published. If you want to know why the things are what they are, read those 3 books. I will not read the titles, but they're interesting. If you want to know how we got that way, read those 3 books. And finally, if you want to know the way out, read Personalist Manifesto by Emmanuel Mounier. It makes it in the first slot right there, right? So it's just been published. Feels like a little name drop for someone who was arranging the publication of the translation. Let's take a look at this. So as Patty mentioned, a Personalist Manifesto, out of print now, but findable online, was translated from the French by the monks of St. John's Abbey at Peter Maurin's insistence. He had some contacts there, including especially this man, Virgil Michel, very important leader in the liturgical movement in the United States, who I was stunned to learn died a matter of months after writing the introduction to this book, maybe 3 or 4 months later, at the age of 48, from pneumonia occasioned by exhaustion. So this is a man who was absolutely packing his schedule. Maurin knew him. He agreed to write the introduction and to have the work translated. Notably, the work was translated by a monk of the abbey who prefers to remain anonymous. Oh, that was beautiful. Michel writes in his introduction to the work, the greatest of the evils of materialistic civilization is perhaps the depersonalization of man. This is Michel's effort to kind of take Mounier's language, bring it into the American conversation. The reduction of man to a mere cog in a machine, very 1930s phrase, or a microcosmic robot of the macrocosmic robot that is the gigantic industrial Frankenstein of today. Good use of language there, I would propose. A civilization, he says further on, built up on the fertile but forgotten concept of the person must necessarily be social rather than individualistic, but it cannot be collectivist or totalitarian. And that's what all of these personalist thinkers, as thinkers, are trying to just navigate that Scylla and Charybdis between individualism and collectivism. I mean, something you often hear about today, right? But this is in a very distinctive kind of 1930s mode. The book has 4 parts, and just to highlight them for our reference. I mean, Mounier begins by stating the problem. Part 1, the modern world is the enemy of the person. The bourgeois individualists have it wrong, the fascists have it wrong, and the new Marxist man, the Marxists have it wrong. What is personalism? He lays out these principles, and he focuses then on the question of the communitarian nature of it. Again, Maurin, Dorothy Day comments at some point that he would just go around the Catholic worker in 1952 or something, she says this, and quote from the French of this book and translate it for the edification and improvement of all hearers. Principles of a personalist civilization. What is a person? So then we have, and to my purpose here, I would emphasize, abstract ideas, right? Embodiment, action, integration, singularity, transcendence, liberty, communion. This is clearly a philosophy student writing this, right? This is clearly someone who's trying to work out things on the highest level of abstraction. Chief structures of a personalist system. So here he gets a little more concrete, Mounier. Talks about, in order, education, private life, the culture of the person, capitalism as the enemy of the person, principles of personalist economy, the political society, international and interracial society. By the way, Mounier was very interested in distributism. He was kind of aware of the distributist movement in the UK, and often distributism and personalism have been thought about together in relation to economics. And then he concludes with these principles of personalist action. Our last slide here on the book. What methods are we to use? What are we to do? With whom are we to work? I mean, to me, it reads, he's trying to kind of map out all of the practical steps before he takes the practical steps in a certain way, you know? And that there was a utility to that. But I emphasize it because I think it's different than what Peter and Dorothy were doing, right? Peter and Dorothy were hitting the ground running immediately, whereas Mounier was trying to kind of define the space and set it up with the idea that people could inhabit it if they choose. So Peter did, in fact, hit the ground running here. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and humanists, he says, are all included in his brief. Well, he included exactly those 4 constituencies in 1938 here at the Labor Temple in New York City on East 14th Street, now home to KFC, it seems. At the time, the Labor Temple, Peter Maurin organized something called a series of symposia on personalist democracy. Mark Ellis writes about this in his very important book on Peter Maurin. This was the spring of 1938. It was done in conjunction with the publication of the book. So what was the aim? The clarification of thought, of course, by free presentation and discussion of a subject of common concern. Participants were encouraged to give full expression to their views. I write in reading Ellis's account of this event, and not to minimize or dilute them in search for a common denominator. And I think this is really characteristic of Maurin's understanding of personalism, that each person should express her views in the most robust and full way possible in charity, right? You shouldn't pull back and try and find the lowest common denominator, but each person should feel empowered and welcomed and able to express herself completely. We had 4 representatives on the board, sponsors of the symposium. We had Baldwin representing personalist humanist position. You can read the others here: personalist theist, personalist Christian, personalist Catholic. Interesting, all 4 identified as personalists. So personalist is kind of like Zen, right? You can just attach it to something. Zen Catholic, right? You know that book, Patty. Zen Catholicism, right? Who was that? Aylward Graham, I think. It was a while back now. But, there you have it. And I think that personalism, in that sense, could almost be a kind of inflection, kind of an accent placed on any kind of approach. And which is why it's so hard to pin down, to the infuriation of my dissertation advisors. What is it? What is it, John? Tell me what it is. This is a castle. In fact, it's a chateau, French chateau in the town of Uriage. We'll come to that in just a moment. So where did Mounier's personalism go during the war and after? I would just start by this. So we have actually in the room Jeffrey Gnews, I think, yes? Where's Jeffrey? Hi, Jeffrey. This is your quote, Jeffrey. So in 1988, Jeffrey wrote the following: Mounier's influence on Maurin and the Catholic worker has been significant. Maurin, however, did not derive his personalism from Mounier. And that's important, because we're talking about Mounier and Maurin, right? It's not like Maurin picked up Mounier and said, gosh, personalism, I've never thought of this before. Maurin had thought of it before. Maurin, by the way, knew Charles Péguy, very important influence on, like personally knew him, right? So Maurin was developing his own thinking, Mounier was developing his own thinking, and they were in the same kind of space and influenced one another. But when we separate them, it's a natural and important thing to do. By the time Mounier had started publishing Esprit, Maurin had already devised his philosophy. His personalism expressed what Maurin had already been writing about in his essays. I think that's important. Also, author Farrell, in his book The Spirit of the 60s, making a very interesting connection, by the way, between personalist communitarianism and the counterculture movement of the 60s. Very interesting. Where did, hey man, let's form a commune and get out of the world, right? I mean, this is very much a personalist kind of thing. We're gonna break out of the systems. We're not going to be bound by systems and rules and constrictions, right? We're just going to encounter one another in freedom. So in that book, he writes concerning Maurin, Maurin's personalism both preceded and proceeded from the personalism of Mounier, the decentralism of Mounier and Berdyaev. Although he anticipated many of the ideas of the French personalists, Maurin also brought their ideas to an American audience. So he anticipated, he popularized, and he developed. In 1942, so it's a few years after the symposia, a few years after the manifesto's out, right? Maurin's been kind of percolating in that. He writes his easy essay called Emmanuel Mounier. Emmanuel Mounier wrote a book entitled A Personalist Manifesto. Indeed, he has been influenced by Charles Péguy. Charles Péguy once said there are 2 things in the world: politics and mysticism. We may know this from his book, The Temporal and the Eternal. Very beautiful book. For Péguy, as well as Mounier, politics is the struggle for power, while mysticism is the realism of the spirit. A beautiful phrase on which we could probably have an entire keynote. For the man of the street, politics is just politics, and mysticism is the right spirit. Cryptic, interesting. In his Personalist Manifesto, Mounier tries to explain what the man of the street calls the right spirit. Now, you just saw the table of contents for the Personalist Manifesto. That's pretty high-flying, 30,000-foot stuff, right? So I feel like this is maybe Maurin trying to understand, well, what was that Personalist Manifesto all about, right? It's not just a program that you can implement and run with, right? What is the spirit, as it were, of this? I also want to emphasize this because I think that we can understand what happened to Mounier and personalism in France, or at least some of the events that occurred in the 40s and 50s, by reference to Peggy. He has here in the book, The Temporal and the Eternal, a well-known passage. Everything begins, he says, as a mystique and ends as a politique. Mystique and politique. Peggy has an organic understanding of the development of culture. You start with hope and vision and freshness and energy, and then eventually, through kind of Weberian routinization of charisma, it becomes stultified and rule-focused and limited. And so the goal here, he says, I'll just hop to the very last part of this quote. The whole point, what matters, the essential thing, is that in each order, in each system, the mystique should not be devoured by the politique to which it gave birth. As a movement develops, the politique, the administrators, right? So I mean, the mystique is the faculty and the politique is the administration. And God bless the administrators, right? But there is a danger that the administration is going to take over because it's just efficient. And we have to be concerned about the bottom line. It's a natural progression, right? And so I think what we see with personalism during the war and after, it echoes a little bit of this. Here, Mel Peel, very important work, Breaking Bread, from 1982, study of the Catholic worker movement. He writes, in the post-war years, many of the Catholic worker came to believe that Mounier had weakened his distinctively Catholic stance through too close a cooperation with French communists and other progressives. Mounier was very confident about technology, about the future, about the ability to cooperate with people on the left to achieve progress and good things, right? And he wanted personalism not just to be a kind of philosophically inclined Christianity. He wanted it to be a philosophy, right? He wanted it to stand on its own. In fact, in the 1950s, if you look at the works from that time, kind of on the intellectual climate, they'll say, well, you have the communists, the existentialists, and the personalists. And the personalists are just Catholic existentialists, right? So that was kind of the intellectual terrain, right? And Mounier wanted to occupy that space. And so he died in 1950, but he was setting it up for that. In the 1940s, he wrote this book, Mounier, The Existentialist Tree. This is probably the most famous picture that Mounier ever came up with. So there at the bottom of the tree, you have the roots of, he's writing this book about existentialism, broadly speaking. You have Pascal and Socrates and the Stoics, St. Augustine and St. Bernard of Clairvaux. So these are kind of the deep taproots of existentialism on his conception of that. And then you have Kierkegaard just shooting up the trunk. So everything comes out of Kierkegaard, which I think is a fair reading. Iris Murdoch loved this book, by the way. And then at the top of the tree, you have this very interesting conglomeration of people. So you have Sartre, Heidegger, and Nietzsche over there on the left branches. And they are like protected from the rest by phenomenology. Phenomenology is like positioned in the middle. And then over here, you've got Gabriel Marcel, Karl Jaspers, and personalism, just kind of tucked away. I think it's the smallest branch on the tree, by the way. It's very humble on Mounier's part. I'm sure he drew this himself. But he wanted personalism to be recognizable as a standalone philosophy, as part of the kind of larger conversation. Lots of other figures here. Berdyaev is there with a different kind of transliteration. Shevstov, Vladimir Soloviev, very important fellow traveler. By the way, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has written his dissertation on Vladimir Lossky, kind of personalist thinker in the Eastern Orthodox vein. I would say that Rowan Williams is a really important thinker of personalism in our day. May he live long. So one thing that Mounier was doing, right, is trying to make personalism this kind of standalone philosophy, not simply thoughtful Christianity, right? But there were other things happening too. So in the 1930s, I mentioned earlier, there were other personalist movements, and Maritain was a bit worried about personalism for this reason, because all the 20-year-olds were just hot in the head with personalism. They didn't like Third Republic. They wanted to overthrow the bourgeois limitations of society and so forth. And they were a little too close to the other thing that was happening in the 1930s, which is the spread of fascism, right? And Maritain and Mounier also, I mean, they wanted to go nowhere near that. And that's why Maritain kind of, sicked Berdyaev on Mounier, because he's like, you need somebody to mentor this, right? We can't just let it run its course. because he saw what was happening elsewhere. Well, one thing that happened elsewhere is the influence of this fellow Raymond de Becker, who was from Belgium and moved back to Belgium, but he was a founder of this movement, L'Autre Nouveau, in Paris. And this movement is comparable to the kind of brown shirts at the time, right? I mean, this is a scary movement. This is not people having roundtable discussions, right? And Maritain saw that. And in fact, if you look at, I talk about this in his dissertation, if you look at Maritain's discussions of the person, he sometimes uses the term personalism, but in a very careful way. Like he'll use it as a philosophy or as kind of a vague designation for some kind of movement in the present, but never as a political term. Like he never calls himself a personalist, Jacques Maritain, interestingly, to my mind. Maurin here mentions Raymond de Becker in 1935. I mean, in 1935, all of this kind of had yet to play out. But de Becker, unfortunately, turned out to be in Belgium a kind of lead collaborator with the Nazi occupiers. And this was a bit of a stain, This was a very significant stain on this strand of thinking. For more on this, and I just want to celebrate for about 30 seconds here the work of the historian John Hellman. Are we familiar with John Hellman? There are a few scholars, friends, and I look at their book and I say, that is scholarship. I had a basketball coach from middle school. Whenever we did well, he'd say, now that's basketball. This is scholarship. 1981, John Hellman's real excited about John Paul II and his personalism. He wrote this little thing on Simone Weil, beautiful book, obviously like very much on the order of thinking of folks in this room. He thinks John Paul II is going to be like a radical Mounier-style personalist. He's like, Laborum exercens. He's very excited about Laborum exercens. But it turns out he writes this book on Emmanuel Mounier and the New Catholic Left, kind of an intellectual history of Mounier himself. Okay, 12 years later, the Night Monks of Vichy, France, Uriage, 1940 to 45, because what happened there? The Vichy government decided they kind of liked the language of the human person. Sounded like a great way of sticking it to all those bourgeois liberals. So someone who was the Minister of Education in the Vichy government, who had been Mounier's philosophy instructor in his, what's the high school philosophy education in France? Lycée, right, in Lycée. That person had become the Minister of Education in Vichy and starts talking about the human person, all of that. So Mounier begins to think, well, maybe there's something here. I mean, maybe this isn't so bad after all. And he goes off to lecture at this place, Uriage, set up by the Vichy government to educate young people. After about a year, it becomes clear that whatever Mounier's doing and whatever the Vichy government doing are very different, and they ask him to leave, and then they censor Esprit, and Mounier goes into hiding and becomes a hero of the resistance, and so forth. But there was this moment where Mounier was actually kind of confused, right? And it seemed like he was flirting with that, and Hellman traces this masterfully. And then in 2002, the communitarian third way, Alexander Marc and L'Autre Nouveau, this being a movement, if memory serves, connected with what de Becker was doing. This trio of books across 30 years, to my mind, is just a masterful telling of the story in all of its painfulness as well, right? Because we want Mounier to be a straightforward hero, just championing the human person, and we're all happy and everything's great. But it's just not true. And he tells the story in such a sensitive way, with such detail. I think it's a beautiful thing. Denis de Rougemont, another thinker of this time, a kind of fellow traveler of Mounier there in Frankfurt. This picture struck me when I was working on the dissertation. I mean, did they have to put the flag in the middle? I mean, couldn't they have put the flag anywhere else? Sorry, that's a swastika flag, if you can't see it. So this troubles me, right? Because Mounier doesn't like the deadening effect of bourgeois individualist culture. He wants people to come together and be strong and healthy, and what are the Nazis doing? What are the fascists doing, right? It's confusing, but that's not a confusion we want or can afford. Last section here, and we're just about 5 more minutes of our time. So where does the Catholic worker movement go? I mean, we've talked about Mounier. He's trying to kind of get personalism legit as a philosophy, not just thoughtful Christianity. He's getting a little confused around the edges with the whole Vichy 1930s thing, although he comes out, I would say, quite right in the end. things are a little different in the United States. William Miller, by the way, another beautiful author, study of the Catholic worker movement, a Harsh and Dreadful Love from 1973 or so. Some of us might be familiar with that. Beautiful, beautiful telling of the history of the movement. He writes in his biography of Dorothy Day, what Peter Maurin did for Dorothy was to reorient her vision from the object to the subject, from collectivism to Christian personalism. So when Dorothy was writing for the masses, when she was a journalist, when she traveled to Washington, D.C. with the marchers and had her experience in the cathedral there in the basement, she was interested in collectivism in some sense. And when she joined the Catholic Church, perhaps partly motivated by that, she didn't want to let go of that. It was Maurin who gave her that language. I think that what Maurin and Day did together is take this abstract, heady, 20-something philosophy grad student movement in France and make it into something that, number one, was recognizably Christian and was rooted in real human circumstance. It made it into the personalism that I think all of us in the room would want to see celebrated. Day writes in 1942, and I haven't specified the sources here, but you'll find them in the dissertation, the fundamental principle of personalism is the liberty of Christ, a pregnant phrase. Example rather than coercion, love rather than hate, the folly of the cross, serving rather than being served, taking the least place. Compare this to individualism, collectivism, communism, bourgeois, it's a very different tone. Peter's little essay she writes next year on personalism could be summed up in the phrase, what makes man human? And to be what you want the other fellow to be. This is such refreshing concreteness from Dorothy Day. In lots of ways, she took this language of personalism that Maurin had introduced, and I think with him and in her conversations with him, drew out the content that makes it not just a part of the existentialist tree, but a distinctively Christian way of life. Peter, she writes, is always getting back to Francis of Assisi, St. Francis, who was most truly the, quote, great personalist. In his poverty, rich. In renouncing all, possessing all. Generous, giving out of his heart, sowing generously and reaping generously. Humble and asking when in need, possessing freedom and all joy. These, in her mind, are qualities of the personalist, of someone practicing personalism. Christian personalism is, helpful definition from Dorothy Day, 1947, the realization of the dignity of the other fellow, of our obligations to him, the willingness to work with him on those elements of the truth he has seized hold of, accompany him perhaps, accepting his cooperation as far as he will give it, and the refusal to admit disappointment when he doesn't go as far as we think he might. She also continued to wrestle with this distinction that I mentioned earlier between personalism and communitarianism. I mean, Mounier insisted that they should be published together, say the words together, but it's very hard to see how do they fit. And throughout the decades here following Peter's death, Day returned to this, again, building on what she had received from Peter. The personalist and communitarian revolution, which Emmanuel Mounier, Day writes in 1955, wrote of, is still unbalanced in that the emphasis is still on the personalist instead of on the communitarian. If I put personalism on my existentialist tree, what am I doing? I'm thinking of the individual experience and angst and anxiety, but it's like Kierkegaard, so it's Christian, right? Dorothy Day, 1955. St. Francis was the personalist, St. Benedict the communitarian. A longer version of this, she talks about ora et labora, which was mentioned earlier. Peter, she emphasized how he liked to refer to Benedict. One cannot be a personalist without being a communitarian, 1956. Okay, making some progress here, so I better be a communitarian first. But personalism is a prelude and absolute prerequisite to communitarianism. Back and forth. You can't just have one or the other. So we get to the 1960s here, and Mark and Louise Vick, I think, right? Yeah, wonderful book. They make a, I think, very important point that many of us perhaps have experienced or seen. The revolution, they write, the revolution of the 60s and the disillusionment related to the Vietnam War affected Catholic worker, especially the farm at Tivoli, where youth gathered who were completely unaware of the roots of the Catholic worker movement. Some of those young people mistook the freedom of the gospel for license, common problem throughout the history of Christianity. Dorothy increasingly found things to dismay her. So we're having our revolution. Don't worry, it's a personalistic communitarian revolution. We're kind of figuring out the balance there. It's something to do with Mounier, but it's a little different, it's more concrete. When the new generation comes, all of these efforts at articulation and confusion about the philosophies, well, it's resulted in their not kind of receiving the message clearly, right? So what is this personalist community? Is it Catholic? Is it Christian? So what Dorothy Day does in personal letters and in a couple of the day by day, the column in the paper, she returns in 1973 and again in 1976 very explicitly to the roots of the movement. And she talks about what is the Catholic worker movement? How does it relate to personalism? She writes in 1973, when are we going to read, study, enrich ourselves with all this stimulating thought Peter Maurin has given us glimpses of? When are we going to get a chance to read Personalism, 1950, by Emmanuel Mounier, that young man who started Esprit in Paris the same year the worker started, and the book Peter Maurin was the first to translate into English. Mounier died young, but he lived fully and accomplished much for, quote, the clarification of thought that Peter talked of as the first step in rebuilding the social order. Indeed. Continuing, same passage, Peter Maurin's function as teacher and leader of the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day in 1973 says, was to translate for us Emmanuel Mounier's Personalist Manifesto, to talk to us about the personalist communitarian revolution, which Mounier wrote about in Esprit. Mounier's last book, Personalism, is in paperback, published by Notre Dame Press, Indiana. Get it! May 1973. By the way, that book is still in press and published yearly by Notre Dame Press in Indiana. So if you want to get it, you can get it on Amazon. It's $12. I have these here, so just briefly. So this is the very last references that I've been able to locate in Dorothy's letters or published works to Mounier. This is in May of 1976, this in the following slide. Jacques Maritain said, and she's talking about not Jacques Maritain, even though Maurin is portrayed here. Maritain said that our first storefront headquarters reminded him of Charles Péguy's shop in Paris, where students and workers gathered. Péguy was the great influence in the life of Emmanuel Mounier, young student at the Sorbonne Esprit, which began publication around the same time as ours, which led Maurin to translate for us the Manifesto, which was followed by other articles about the revolution, a necessary but nonviolent revolution, which Mounier called the personalist communitarian. Okay, so she's rehearsing here the details of the story, I think, for the new generation, trying to remind the members of the movement of the origin of the movement, something that she still considers a key part of the origin of the movement. It's not just an accidental thing. Dorothy Day, in 1976, if you ask her, what are you about, what are you doing? She will say, we are enacting the personalist and communitarian revolution of Emmanuel Mounier. That's significant, right? And that's from Maurin. Maurin, she writes, same place, was an advocate of the personalist communitarian revolution, which stemmed from the teaching of such men as Mounier, Berdyaev, and Péguy. Small beginnings of this revolution were made in Paris in the 30s. Through a monthly review, Esprit, Peter brought it to America. And indeed, Peter did bring it to America. And in America, through the houses of hospitality in the worker movement, it flourished on the streets, is my claim to you this evening, in the form of Catholic activism. What Mounier and his colleagues tried to do, and it's lovely, the Friends of Emmanuel Mounier. It's a very nice group, mostly older folks in France. They get together, they have an email newsletter, nice website, all in French. You can see it. It's very nice, right? But it's very different than the Catholic worker movement. And I think we have reason to be deeply grateful to Peter for bringing this French set of ideas to the United States, but especially for him and Dorothy transforming it and breaking it open and making it something that has and can nourish life. And that's what I have for you, friends.